Please join me in welcoming Fredrick Wiseman.
Thank you.
So we're going to talk for a little bit, and then we're going to hear some questions from you guys. I'm sure you'll have some. But considering the time we have, we couldn't possibly talk about more than 40 films that you've made. But with National Gallery playing right now, and it's down the street, and if you haven't seen it, please do see it. I'd love to talk about some of the choices that you make as a filmmaker, both in what you make films about, how you make them, or you shoot them, and then how you construct them. And if maybe let's center that around National Gallery so that we have a way in. Can we talk in generally, and then specifically with National Gallery, how you choose your subjects, how you make your way into a place like National Gallery? I know it's different for each one. So have you always wanted to make a film about a museum? Is the National Gallery in particular something you were drawn to?
Well, it's also a big roll of the dice. The real model for this kind of filmmaking is Las Vegas, because the chance cuts through so many different aspects of the filmmaking. I always wanted to do a movie about a museum, and about 30 years ago I tried at the Metropolitan in New York, and they wanted to get paid, and I never pay anybody, and so I abandoned the idea. And then I was skiing in 2000, I think in 10, and I met a woman at a ski resort who worked at the National Gallery, and she asked me whether I was interested in doing a movie about a museum, and I said, sure, I always wanted to, and she introduced me to the director of the National Gallery, Nicholas Penny, and I went to see him, and we said, okay.
Well, it's interesting that
If I hadn't gone skiing, I wouldn't have made the film.
And then, and so there's never, obviously you're not going to pay for the Met, and you're not paying for the National Gallery. Is there any discussion that happens as far as like what you intend to do, what you intend to focus on?
I say, as I said to Nicholas Penny and to the other people from whom I've requested permission, that I want to be around for anywhere from 6 to 12 weeks. In the case of the National Gallery, it was 12. That I don't do any research in advance. That the shooting of the film is the research, that I accumulate a lot of footage. In the case of National Gallery, it was 170 hours. If there's anything they don't want shot, they have to tell me in advance. And in the case of National Gallery, the only thing I couldn't shoot was executive committee meetings where they were discussing personnel issues. I had a pass where we weren't accompanied at all. I could go there any time of the day or night I wanted, and the people at the National Gallery didn't see the film until it was completely finished. Mixed, color graded, everything.
And do you know before you start what you're looking for and what you might focus on?
I have no idea what I'm looking for. I make the assumption that the subject if I hang around long enough at the place that I've chosen as the subject of the film, they'll come across enough material out of which I can edit a film. But I try to approach it with an empty mind and just be open to whatever the experience is at the place. And then and then I have to. It's the old bromide about the sculptor finding the statue under the stone. I have to find the film under the rushes, and it's the opposite of doing a fiction film. In a fiction film, 95% of it is planned and written and planned in advance, and you shoot what you storyboarded, etc. Here, I have to study the rushes, and out of the study of the rushes and trying out lots of possibilities, the film emerges.
And a lot of the time with documentaries, you'll run into filmmakers who've spent 6 months, a year, 2 years with a subject, and they gather that footage, and then they try to bring that down. And in terms of number of hours, it's actually not that dissimilar from the number of hours that you get. You go extraordinarily deep for those 8 to 12 weeks. Can you talk a little bit about what that entails?
Well, I mean, at the National Gallery, I often got there at 8 o'clock in the morning, and many days it didn't close till 10 o'clock at night, or even if it closed, I could still hang around. So there were long days at the National Gallery, and in the evening we watched rushes, and I think I took 2 days off in the 12 weeks that I was there. for me, it's important that I be completely immersed in the subject matter, and one thing often leads to another, and you can't sort of work a day and then come back 3 days later, because you lose the thread and you lose the informants, and I use informants in the best sense of the term, because the people at the place know much more about it than I do, and I'm very dependent on them saying to me, "Oh, Friday at 2:00 there's a meeting," or "You ought to be in the restoration department at 10:00 Saturday morning, because there's going to be a group of Dutch restorers coming in." And that's how I find out what's going on, and when somebody tells me something, I make a little note of it.
And considering how many different layers, and you see the film, you can see that it's shot on the floor of the museum, it's shot behind the scenes with the restorers, with the programmers, with administrators. There's all these different sort of aspects and layers of this institution that you make your way into. Are you doing that systematically, or are you bouncing around over the course of the time?
No, bouncing around. I mean, systematically in the sense that I know I want to go to all those places, but it's not as if the first 4 days in the restoration department, the next 2 days in the scientific department. It's partially chance and partially somebody telling me that they think something interesting is going on at the particular time. And sometimes it's just wandering by and you see a group of people in the room and you go in and see what's going on, and sometimes nothing is going on, and sometimes something really great is going on.
Right. And I've asked you this before, but I think it's interesting to address, which is the degree to which the camera is running. How often the camera is just running, whether or not something in that moment is what you want.
Yeah, once I decide something is worth shooting, we continue right to the end of whatever is going on, because if there's only one rule that I know of in this kind of shooting, and if you try to anticipate what somebody's going to say or do, you're inevitably wrong. So the safest thing to do is, if you make up a mind a sequence is worth shooting, you shoot all the way through, because you know that the moment you stop, that's going to be the magic moment.
Right, right. And is there anything in particular for this subject is there any aspect of this that you felt that you wish that you had more time, that you wish that you could have made the entire film about any one of these aspects?
No, because I never want to make an entire film about any one of the aspects. The place is always the star, whatever that means. But it's always a movie about a place and the kinds of relationships that exist, and the application of whatever ideology the place either does represent or seems to represent.
Mm-hmm. And you direct and do sound and edit your own films, and the
Right.
sound aspect of it is interesting to me, because it's not your camera that we're seeing when we're seeing the film, but it would seem to me that in recording sound, that acts as a form of direction to some degree.
Well, it does. I mean, that is the way I lead with the mic, and I mean, you can't make a good movie without good picture and good sound, and you have to try and get them both.
And if we just back up a little bit, how did it come to pass that became your way of doing that in terms of sound rather than
Well, by doing the
picture?
sound, it gives me more leeway to see what's going on and make the choices about what I want shot.
In terms of if you're looking through the lens.
If you're looking through the lens, you've got one eye. The cameraman has one eye on the lens, one eye on me. I have one eye on him and one eye on what's going on.
Right, right. And you work with some of the same camera people.
Yeah, I worked basically with two over the years. One for about 14 or 15 years, and the other for about 30.
Mm-hmm. And what I think is also, and I sort of hinted at this a little bit in my introductory comments, is that there's an aspect of this that I think that your films, it shows you the impact that they have and the impression that they make for what they capture. But there's this idea that you're just rolling film, and the camera's running, and then whatever you happen to be there for is what the film is. When instead,
that's a naive idea which has been encouraged by the digital revolution.
Right.
Because there are, I mean, I haven't done the math, but there are probably millions of choices involved. And it's not simply a question of putting the camera in a corner of the room. That's why I detest the term observational cinema, or direct cinema, or whatever, some of those other noxious phrases, because everything involves choice. Choice of subject matter, when to shoot, how you shoot it, when to stop, how you're going to use it, where it's going to be placed, whether there's sound transitions, when you use cutaways and reducing a sequence from an hour and a half to 6 minutes, etc. I mean, there literally are millions of choices, and it's it's not the avid editing machine that makes the choices. Somebody once wrote a review of one of my films and said the film would have been a better film if I'd edited it on an Avid rather than a flatbed, a Steenbeck, a regular editing machine. And I thought it was very funny because it suggested it was the machine or the program that made the choices. And whether you're editing digitally or editing on film, in the case of my films, I'm making the choices. And the choices are no different. Whether you use you're editing digitally or you're editing on film.
Mm-hmm. And literally, your process has been the same between the two.
Yeah, the process is exactly the same.
So let's talk a little bit about that process, because you said in the beginning that with a fiction film, you've got a script that dictates the shape of things. You don't know what you're going to get, and you don't know until you sit down to start editing what shape this is going to be, or even in a sense what the film's going to be about.
I have no idea what the film's going to be about till I'm well along in the editing, maybe 6 or 8 months into the editing. Because what I do, I can briefly go through the...
Sure.
When I come back, during the shooting, I watch silent rushes. Sometimes now digitally I watch synced up rushes. When I come back, I look at all the rushes and I make notes about them. That usually, in the case of National Gallery, probably took me a couple of months. At the end of that couple of months, I put aside about 50% of the material, and I had notes on all the material. Then over the course of the next 8 months, I edited all the sequences that I thought might make it into the final film. And it was only, and I edited those in close to what I thought at the time would be the final form. And then when I have all those so-called candidate sequences edited in a close to final form, I then begin working on the first assembly of the material. And then I do that in maybe 3 or 4 days, because at that point I know the material extremely well, and I can make the changes quickly because everything is usable. And that first assembly comes out to about 30 or 40 minutes longer than a final film. And then in the course of the next 6 to 8 weeks, I work on the internal rhythm within the sequences and the transitions between the sequences, and fiddle around a lot with the order. And then when I think the film is finished, I go back and look at all the rushes all over again to make sure there's nothing I've forgotten, or I come across something that solves an editorial problem that I hadn't adequately dealt with previously. But at least 50%, I don't know what the percentage is, but at least 50% of the editing has nothing to do with the technical aspects of editing. It has to do with responding to the question why. Editing, it's an analysis of human behavior, and you have to figure out what's going on in a sequence, why people use the words they do, why do they move left rather than right, why does somebody interrupt somebody else, why does somebody ask for a cigarette at some crucial moment? Is it for a change of the subject, or just want to smoke? Whether you're right or you're wrong, you have to be able to explain, to understand and explain the behavior of the people you have in the rushes. Because if you don't do that, you can't make the choices. And you can't, for example, at Berkeley, or some of the chancellor's cabinet meetings were an hour and a half long. The executive committee meetings at the National Gallery were sometimes 2 hours long. As they appear in the film, the longest is maybe 7 or 8 minutes. And that 7 or 8 minutes is assembled from all over the place. It might be 30 seconds here, 20 seconds there, 80 seconds there, but edited together to appear as if it took place the way you're seeing it in the film. So you want to create the illusion, however transitory, that it happened that way. But in order to do that, you have to at least convince yourself that you understand what's happening and that the way you edit it is an accurate and fair representation of what you observed initially during the shooting and what you thought during the editing.
And is that something that is an actual struggle between giving a fair and accurate representation and making it work within that larger narrative, that tapestry, the artistry of that?
I don't know if it's a struggle, but it's work.
Yeah.
Because it has to work in a variety of levels. It has to work in terms of coherence. It has to work in terms of fairness. It has to work visually. It has to work rhythmically. It has to be clear. You have to provide enough information so that somebody who wasn't present and hadn't studied the rushes can understand what's going on. And all those elements are constantly being juggled, and you have to, you have to be aware of them. It's obvious you have to be aware of them. Otherwise, you can't make the choices. And that's why this kind of filmmaking has absolutely nothing to do with, buying a digital camera and turning it on and becoming a filmmaker.
Right, right. Well, I think that's the great, though that's an inaccuracy when people have that assumption. To me, in a sense, it's a compliment to your ability to make those 7.5 minutes seem like it's the extent of a meeting. That's
the effort in any film, because you have to at least initially, even if you're wrong, you have to convince yourself that it works.
Right, right. Let's talk a little bit about the larger structure of what you assemble, as well as you're saying, there's this sort of those scenes that you're giving integrity to, but then working within larger tapestry. But then that larger work is not necessarily like a lot of other films. Is there a metaphor that helps you, or a different type of art that helps you in terms of that you relate to that? Is it music? Is it novelistic? Is there something that helps along those lines?
The whole question of influence is one that I, don't necessarily understand. But I think to the extent that I'm aware of the kind of things I've been influenced by, it's been much more novels and poetry than it is film. And I think my films are novelistic rather than journalistic. When my films or anybody's films works, it works, I think, because it has to work on two levels. It has to work on the literal level, who says what to whom, what's going on, where are they, etc. But it has to work on an abstract or metaphoric level, which means what are the ideas that are being suggested by the sequences you used and the way you order them.
Okay.
And I think any film has to proceed on both those tracks simultaneously.
Right.
And the real film is in the relationship between the two.
Right. We're just going to watch a clip from the film, so we can watch, in particular, I think what we were just saying a moment ago about collapsing what is a sort of actually in real time a longer piece, a longer real conversation that you've whittled down to something that's a little bit shorter. So let's watch this from National Gallery.
That's a very short clip. And the original event was probably about 20 minutes. And as it is in the film, it's probably about 3.
About 3.
And as you saw and heard it was about 10 seconds.
So what's interesting, just seeing that very brief clip, she's an incredibly charismatic woman who does a fantastic job of addressing these people in the gallery about this painting. It's a painting? That work? Is it technically
It's a 13th century altarpiece.
Altarpiece, yeah. What's remarkable is that we don't know anything about her. We never learn anything about that woman. We get her in this environment speaking about this.
It depends what you mean by knowing about her. You don't know her name, you don't know her training, you don't know whether she has a PhD or not, you don't know whether she's married and has children, but you do know, when you listen to her for more than 10 seconds, that she's very knowledgeable about what she's talking about, and is making a very clear and lucid exposition of the painting. Mm-hmm. So that's quite a bit.
Oh, it's quite a bit, and I think it's plenty. But can you speak a little bit about how that functions in your film, rather than if you were to take it the different tack, if you were going to go deep into her and tell us everything about her, rather than what we get to know about her, and how that functions in your film.
I've been criticized in this movie and also for the 2 ballet movies that I've done that I don't identify, for example, in La Danse or ballet, who the dancers are. But my feeling was if people knew a lot about dance, they would recognize the dancers. And if they didn't know about dance, the fact that I said that's Agnes Letestu or Aurélie Dupont wouldn't mean a thing. And if I did that, I wouldn't know where to stop. Would I just do it for the étoile dances? What about the principal dances? What about for the corps? What about for the ballet masters? What about for the choreographers? And the print would completely ruin the image. And it's equally true here. If I identified the paintings or identified the speakers, it becomes too didactic. Part of my job as the editor is to provide you with enough information so you can understand the sequence, but understanding the sequence doesn't necessarily know that that woman, for example, has a PhD in art history from Oxford.
Well, and I think that it means that these sequences will have an integrity that sequences in other films don't have, in the sense that, and I think this speaks a little bit to what you're saying about the challenges of making it work rhythmically, the sequence work on its own terms as well as within the larger film, is that you allow things within these sequences, or you show things within these sequences that you often don't get, in terms of there's space, there's the full shape of sentences. You get there's sort of like there's an integrity to the rhythms of what happened in that room. And why is that important to you? Because a lot of people will do jump cuts and as such to sort of make sure that they whittle it down to the words and to exactly what matters.
Well, I feel I have an obligation to the people who gave me permission to film them and record their voices to make something that fairly, the word I use rather objective is fair, to make either a sequence or a film that fairly represents what's going on. Of course, fear is completely subjective. It's my judgment, it's my choice, et cetera, et cetera. But I work very hard not to distort the material. For example, you can make fun of anybody in a film, but if the comedy emerges from a manipulation by the filmmaker, it's the filmmaker who is the fool. But if the comedy emerges from the situation, well, then it's just a funny situation, which you happen to have a chance to be present at and use in the film. And I think the former is not all right, and the latter is.
Right. And you have infinite possibilities for doing the former. You can make anybody look funny.
You can make anybody, but actually, you can make anybody look like an idiot, but ultimately, the person who looks like the idiot is you.
Of course, I see that. How do you feel, we talked about, you mentioned how you feel about terms like direct cinema, and you didn't say verite, but I know you're not a fan of that either. How do you feel about documentarian?
I just think I make movies.
Yeah.
I mean, the word documentary, at least maybe is my generation, but when I was growing up, the documentary was like, people used it, they applied it like the term X-lax. It was supposed to be good for you, and make you a better person. And I think I make dramatic narrative movies, which happen to be based on real experience, people's real experiences.
Do you feel at all that the way that we talk about films and documentaries in particular has finally caught up to that a little bit? Do you feel like there's more?
It depends who's talking.
Right.
Because I don't see a lot of movies, documentaries of any sort, but some of the documentaries I see, they're too simple-minded. They treat the audience like idiots, and as a result, they're very condescending, or they're trying to sell a political point of view or a particular ideology, which isn't very interesting because it ignores the actual complexity of the subject matter.
Right. And I think would it be fair to say that you're presenting the complexity of the subject matter at the same time as there's a lot of yourself in these films?
Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, sure. I think there's a lot of myself in the film because I'm making the choices.
Right.
But it's an indirect expression. When I said I think the movies are more novelistic than journalistic, that's why I said that. Because I think there's a lot of a writer in any novel, except it's indirect. The point of view is indirect, very indirectly stated.
Is there anything in particular about this? I mean, for me, I'm very moved by this film, and in ways that you wouldn't necessarily expect for the form that it takes. And I relate to it as a critic. I relate to it as a writer, as an artist. And I wonder if you had that experience as well, if you related to these people and what their work was.
Oh, I did. I mean, I had great respect for the people who worked there. And I hope that respect is conveyed in the film. And of course, it was a fantastic opportunity to be at the National Gallery every day for 3 months and look at all these wonderful paintings.
Yeah.
And often we would go in there and the gallery was empty because it was before it opened or after it closed. And you felt like the late Shah of Iran. It was your personal gallery, at least for 20 minutes.
And you don't do interviews for your films. With something like this, are you tempted at all to ask questions because you have them?
No. That's just a matter of liking one technique rather than another. And sometimes, as a National Gallery, you come across film crews using a different style, and I sometimes shoot those sequences because I think they're funny, and they illustrate the contrast between the two approaches to film, or more than two approaches to filmmaking.
Sure. I'm going to read just a quote from, I think this is basically the last words said in National Gallery. It's not a spoiler, but I think it's be worth sort of saying and talking briefly about. It says there's a poet called Joe Shapcott. Is that right? Okay. And she says, this is a quote, "The fact that language isn't perfect, the fact that when I say the word hand, it is not my hand, is really beautiful and poignant to me. In a way, all of my poems are efforts to translate something else, and they never quite do, but the meaning is all in the gaps." And to me, I feel like almost every scene of the film is about those gaps and trying to somehow close them as best as you can, but it's an imperfect science. It's an imperfect science to restore a painting because there's no way to get it back to the way it looked the day that it was finished. And to me, that also felt a bit of the imperfection of what it means to somehow convey what you were there witnessing into a film. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, you never get it all. I mean, it's always an approximation, but nevertheless, it can have a dramatic form, and it can work up to a certain point. But I mean, basically, you do the best you can, and chips fall where they may.
And there's a great beauty in that then too. I think knowing that and acknowledging that, and that acknowledgement being part of the process, allows for really great beauty.
What's the cliche? It's never finished. It's only over.
And have you always felt that way about your films?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't linger when I feel like I know when it's over. But it could be because I'm tired or I want to go skiing or...
Which I think is healthy, that you always have that. I wonder if we should see if anybody has any questions. Yes?
So you've made about 42 films, right? In 47 years. How did you get into making movies? What were you watching as a kid? Tell me everything. I'm curious.
I'll tell you everything. How much time do you have? No, I was always interested in making movies. I made a wrong turn, but I went to law school, and I went to law school basically to avoid the Korean War. And then I hung out in Paris for a couple of years after I got out of the Army when the war was over. And I started to shoot movies in 8 millimeter and Super 8. And then I came back to America, and I taught law for a couple of years and hated it. And that was so long ago. It was before the proliferation of film schools with $40,000 a year tuition, and people wanted to make movies, just either apprentice themselves to somebody else or started to do it. Well, I worked on the production of a film, and that demystified the process of filmmaking for me, and so I decided I could try and do my own, so I did. And the first film was a film about a prison for the criminally insane, and which was called City Cut Follies, and then in doing that film, I realized, I had the idea of doing an institutional series, and it seemed to me that the appropriate follow-on film to A Prison for the Criminally Insane was a high school. And so, then I started to do... well, that's a twofer.
Have you ever found yourself in the middle of a project that you assumed, like you said you have with the projects, you think it's going to be interesting and I'll do my best, and panicked and found out that it wasn't interesting?
Not yet. But I may have deceived myself and continued.
Do you have a list of potential projects for the future, or do they come organically over time?
Well, no. I have a list of potential projects, but I don't always follow the list. I mean, I was finishing a film one time, and I had to go to the dentist, and I was in the dentist's office reading People magazine, which is the only place I read People magazine, and there was an article about a model agency. And I realized, yeah, model agency, that sounds like a good subject. So
And that was next. Then.
that became, right at the top of the list.
There's something really delicious about the idea of People magazine being something that inspired you to make a movie.
Well, it was the model agency.
Fred, I just wanted to say it was your film Titicut Follies that turned me into a documentary filmmaker. And now I have the great pleasure of teaching your work at Tisch in the documentary program. But I wanted to ask you a question. I was very interested when you said that when you shoot, you let an event play itself out because you don't want to stop filming. This must have changed, though, after you stopped working with 16 millimeter. Because with 16 millimeter, you must have had 150 rolls of film or 200. And I don't think you would have been able to just say, I'm going to let every event play itself through. So would you comment on how your choices or the decision-making process regarding your choices might have been changed by a change in technology?
Well, it hasn't. Because the films were shot on film the last film that was shot on film was La Danse. And so that's three or four films ago. And I think in digital, maybe shooting a little more, maybe 10% more. But in film, I always felt it was necessary. I've had this view of it being necessary to shoot a lot from the beginning. And this whole issue of digital being cheaper, when you look at it, isn't necessarily the case, because now in order to preserve the film, the final film, the best way to do it is to make a 35 millimeter copy, because digital only lasts about 5 years. So now I'm faced with the expense, which is at least $35,000 or $40,000 a film, of making a 35 negative from the HD master in order, if I want the film to last more than 5 years. And with all changes in technology, nobody's yet, as far as I know, nobody's yet figured out a way of preserving the film. Preserving the HD masters.
Can you talk a little bit about how you distributed your films? And I think early on you decided to self-distribute. So I was wondering why you decided to self-distribute early on. Self-distribution and how you've distributed since
I
then.
decided to self-distribute early on because the first two films I made, I got screwed and cheated by the distributor that had them. So there was 100% margin of error. I mean, Grove Press was the distributor of the first of High School and Titicut Follies, and I discovered that they were making a lot of money and I wasn't getting anything. So it was an easy decision and the smartest, from a business point of view, one that I ever made, because now at least, I hired somebody who likes the movies who flogs them for me. And if she's successful at doing it, the money comes in and we get to keep it. So it worked out. It's a lot of work. Sorry?
Yeah, I said you did all the work.
Yeah, but at least some income came in.
And would you make that decision now in today's?
Well, I don't know
situation?
enough about the alternatives now. I'm still doing it. I've had one person in charge of the distribution of films now for the last 33 years. The difference is a DVD distributor will take 80% of the income. Whereas if you do it yourself, your volume won't be as great, probably, but 100% is yours.
I think
But it
that's
is a lot of work.
Right. I think that's all we have time for. So, everyone, thank you, Frederick Wiseman.
Thank you very much.